Every steak starts the same way. A raw piece of beef, red and cool to the touch. From this point, temperature decides everything. A handful of degrees in either direction changes the color, the texture, the juiciness, and even the flavor. And before we start, one thing worth knowing. That red liquid on the plate, or soaking through the packaging, is not blood. It is myoglobin, a protein that stores oxygen inside muscle cells. The color comes from iron, the same element that makes blood red. All actual blood is drained at the slaughterhouse long before the meat ever reaches a store. Raw. Long before humans figured out how to cook meat over fire, they ate it as it came. And today, two of the most refined dishes in European cuisine still serve beef completely uncooked. Steak tartare is finely chopped raw beef mixed with a raw egg yolk, capers, diced onions, mustard, and Worcestershire sauce. The popular origin story says Tatar horsemen would tenderize meat by placing it under their saddles as they rode across the Central Asian steppe. That story is almost certainly a myth. The dish more likely gets its name from tartar sauce, which was served alongside raw beef preparations in French bistros during the late 1800s. Auguste Escoffier, the legendary French chef, listed a version in his 1903 cookbook Le Guide Culinaire, calling it beefsteak à l'américaine, because the French at the time believed Americans preferred their meat raw. The dish became a Parisian bistro staple by the 1950s and has stayed on menus ever since. Carpaccio came from an entirely different direction. In 1950, a countess named Amalia Nani Mocenigo walked into Harry's bar in Venice and told the owner, Giuseppe Cipriani, that her doctor had put her on a strict diet of raw meat. Cipriani sliced beef paper thin, fanned it across a white plate, and drizzled it with a light creamy sauce. He named the dish after the Renaissance painter Vittore Carpaccio, whose canvases were known for vivid reds and whites, the same colors as the beef and sauce sitting on that plate. One reason whole muscle raw beef can be relatively safe is that bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella live on the surface, not deep inside the tissue. Searing the outside kills most surface contamination, which is why a rare steak carries far lower risk than a rare hamburger. Grinding beef spreads those surface bacteria throughout the meat, and that is exactly why the USDA recommends cooking ground beef all the way to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Blue rare. In French kitchens, this is called bleu, and the name likely comes from the faintly bluish-purple tint that freshly cut beef has before oxygen turns it bright cherry red. A blue rare steak gets seared hard on the outside, usually about 1 minute per side over very high heat, while the interior stays cool and almost completely raw. The center reaches only about 115 degrees Fahrenheit, barely above body temperature. At this internal temperature, the proteins in the meat have barely started to change. Myosin, the first muscle protein to respond to heat, begins breaking down around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, but at 115, it has not finished the process. So the texture is soft, slippery, and cool. The color inside stays deep purple-red because the myoglobin has not been exposed to enough sustained heat to change its structure. Blue rare is the least common order in American steakhouses. A 2019 survey of over 1,200 adults found it was the preference of only about 2% of respondents, tied with people who wanted their steak outright burnt. In France, though, ordering blue is perfectly normal. The French steak scale runs significantly rarer than the American one, and a French kitchen will cook it without hesitation. The trick to cooking blue rare properly is using a very thick cut, at least 1.5 inches, so the surface can develop a real sear before any heat penetrates to the center. Thin steaks are nearly impossible to cook this way because the interior warms up too quickly. The steak should also start closer to room temperature before it hits the pan, which shortens the total cooking time and keeps the center from being uncomfortably cold. Rare. At 125 to 130 degrees Fahrenheit, the steak crosses a subtle but important line. The center is no longer cool, it is warm, and the texture has shifted from the slippery softness of blue to something noticeably different. More myosin has broken down, which means the meat has started to firm up, giving it a tender, buttery quality that raw beef does not have. The interior is still deep red, but it holds together more against the tongue, and the flavor at this temperature is intensely beefy, almost mineral. In France, rare is called saignant, which translates literally to bleeding. The name is misleading since no blood is involved, but the deep red juice that pools on the plate when you slice into a rare steak certainly looks the part. That liquid is water mixed with myoglobin, released from muscle fibers as they begin to contract under heat. Rare works best with tender, low connective tissue cuts like filet mignon and tenderloin, where the natural softness of the muscle benefits from minimal cooking. Tougher cuts with heavy connective tissue need much higher temperatures to break down the collagen and convert it into gelatin. Ordering a rare chuck steak would be a textural mistake. The connective tissue stays chewy and unpleasant without enough heat to soften it. Despite its reputation as a classic order, rare is one of the least popular choices in real-world restaurants. Data collected from all 491 Longhorn Steakhouse locations across the United States over a full year showed that only about 2.5% of customers actually ordered their steak rare. The gap between how often people say they like rare and how often they actually order it is one of the more interesting patterns in American dining. Medium rare. This is the temperature professional chefs around the world consider the sweet spot, and the science backs them up. At 130 to 135 degrees Fahrenheit, three things align inside the meat at once. First, myosin has fully denatured, which means the steak has completely transitioned from raw to cooked in texture. It is tender, but it has structure. Second, collagen in the connective tissue has started to shrink and soften, adding a subtle richness to each bite. And third, actin has not yet begun to break down. Actin is the second major muscle protein, and when it denatures, starting around 150 degrees Fahrenheit, it contracts hard and squeezes water out of the meat. That is the exact mechanism that makes overcooked steak dry and tough. At medium rare, the actin is still intact, so the steak holds on to nearly all of its moisture. The crust on the outside is where a huge amount of the steak's flavor actually lives. When the surface reaches around 280 to 330 degrees Fahrenheit, something called the Maillard reaction kicks in. French chemist Louis Camille Maillard first described it in 1912. Amino acids and sugars on the surface of the beef react together and produce hundreds of new flavor compounds, all those nutty, roasted, caramelized notes that make a properly seared steak smell the way it does. Caramelization only involves sugars. The Maillard reaction requires both protein and sugar to work, and it is the same chemistry that browns bread crusts and darkens roasted coffee beans. There is also a persistent belief that searing a steak seals in the juices. That idea traces back to a German chemist named Justus von Liebig in the 1840s, and it has been debunked repeatedly since. Food scientist Harold McGee has spent decades pointing out that the crust forming on the surface is not waterproof. The sizzling you hear on a hot cast iron pan is the sound of moisture continuously escaping from the meat. Searing builds flavor through the Maillard reaction. It does not create a seal. One thing that catches home cooks off guard is carryover cooking. After the steak leaves the heat, the hot exterior keeps pushing warmth inward, which can raise the center temperature by another 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit depending on thickness. That is why experienced cooks pull their steaks about 5 degrees below the target and let residual heat finish the job during a few minutes of rest on the cutting board. Medium. At 140 to 145 degrees Fahrenheit, the pink center has started to shrink. A warm band of gray-brown has expanded inward from the edges, and the middle holds only a narrowing strip of pale pink. The texture is noticeably firmer than medium rare, and the steak has begun to lose more of its moisture as the earliest stages of actin denaturation squeeze water from the muscle fibers. This is where the USDA draws its safety line. The official recommendation for whole cuts of beef is 145 degrees Fahrenheit, followed by a 3-minute rest, a guideline calibrated for the entire population, including children, elderly people, pregnant women, and anyone with a compromised immune system. Chefs routinely cook below this because surface searing on an intact steak muscle eliminates the bacteria that actually pose a risk. The inside of a whole cut of beef is essentially sterile. Here is where the numbers get interesting. When Americans are asked how they like their steak, surveys consistently put medium rare at the top of stated preferences. But actual order data from every Longhorn Steakhouse location in the country over a full year tells a different story. Medium was the single most popular real-world order, accounting for roughly 1 in 3 steaks served. Medium well came second. Medium rare landed third. There is a consistent gap between what people say they prefer and what they actually ask for when the waiter is standing at the table. In Argentina, the country arguably most devoted to beef, the default at an asado is a punto, which translates roughly to on point and sits right around medium. Ordering rare at a Buenos Aires steakhouse can draw a puzzled look from the asador working the grill. Argentine cuts like vacío and tira de asado tend to carry more fat and collagen than typical American steakhouse selections, and that connective tissue needs higher heat to render properly and turn tender. Cooking those cuts rarer would leave them chewy rather than rich. In France, à point means the same thing, perfectly done, though the French version lands slightly pinker than the American one. A French à point steak would probably be called medium rare at a restaurant in New York. Medium well. At 150 to 155 degrees Fahrenheit, only a faint trace of pink remains in the very center, and some steaks at this temperature show none at all. The meat is firm throughout, and the texture is noticeably drier as actin continues to contract and push moisture from the muscle fibers. Medium well tends to get overlooked in food conversations because it sits in an awkward middle ground. It does not have the juicy tenderness that chefs celebrate in medium rare, and it does not carry the strong identity of well done, which at least has the distinction of being controversial. But medium well is quietly one of the most common orders in American steakhouses. That same full year of Longhorn data showed it as the second most popular doneness, landing ahead of medium rare in real orders. The cuts that handle medium well best are the ones with heavy marbling or a bone running through them. A well-marbled ribeye still has ribbons of intramuscular fat woven through the meat at this temperature, and that rendered fat compensates for the moisture the muscle has lost. Bone-in steaks also hold up better because the bone slows heat transfer on one side, keeping the meat closest to it just a touch juicier. A lean filet mignon cooked to medium well, on the other hand, dries out noticeably because there is almost no fat to fall back on. This is also the doneness that a lot of home cooks end up with by accident. Backyard charcoal grills run unevenly, and without a meat thermometer, what someone intends as medium often quietly climbs a few extra degrees while they are not paying attention. Well done. At 160 degrees Fahrenheit and above, the steak is uniform gray-brown throughout with no trace of pink remaining anywhere. The myoglobin has fully denatured and lost its red color. The actin has contracted completely, and the meat has released a significant portion of its original water content. The texture is firm, dense, and distinctly chewier than anything cooked to a lower temperature. Well done is the single most debated way to eat a steak, at least in Western food media. Anthony Bourdain wrote about it in his famous 1999 essay for The New Yorker, describing how professional kitchens would route their oldest, least desirable cuts of meat toward well-done orders, reasoning that at that level of doneness, the customer would never notice the difference between a fresh piece and one that had been sitting around. Gordon Ramsay has said publicly that he does not eat well-done steak himself, arguing that cooking quality beef past a certain point eliminates the flavors that made it worth buying. But the actual numbers tell a very different story. A 2019 survey of more than 1,200 American adults found well done was the single most selected preference, chosen by roughly 1 in 4 respondents. Women were statistically more likely to choose it than men. And even in real restaurant data, around 12% of all steakhouse orders came in well done, meaning roughly 1 in 8 customers wanted no pink at all. There is a wider cultural reality beyond the food media debate. In many parts of the world, eating pink or red meat simply does not align with deeply rooted food traditions. Across Latin America, parts of Africa, and much of Asia, thoroughly cooked beef is the standard. The Western chef class insistence that medium rare is objectively correct can come across as culturally narrow rather than universally true. Cooking well done properly takes patience and restraint with heat. Blasting a steak at high temperature chars the outside long before the center finishes, leaving a burnt crust over dry gray meat. The better approach is searing briefly to build the crust, then finishing at a lower temperature, either in an oven or on a cooler section of the grill, letting the center come up slowly without scorching the surface. Pittsburgh rare. This one sits outside the normal temperature scale entirely, because it is not about a single doneness level. It is about creating two extremes in the same piece of beef. The exterior is deeply charred, nearly black, while the center stays cool and almost raw, at roughly 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Some people call it black and blue. Black for the crust, blue for the interior. The origin story connects it to the steel industry in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The legend says steelworkers in the early 1900s would cook steaks by pressing them directly against the superheated metal surfaces of blast furnaces and rolling mills, where temperatures ran far beyond anything a kitchen stove could produce. The contact was so brief and so intense that the outside charred almost instantly while the inside barely had time to warm. Whether the story is historically accurate remains debated, but it captures the principle perfectly. Extreme heat, almost no time, and two completely different experiences in a single piece of meat. To cook Pittsburgh rare at home, you need a cast iron skillet, heated as aggressively as your stovetop allows, a thick cut of steak at least 1.5 inches, and roughly 90 seconds per side. Some chefs add a blowtorch to deepen the char without extending cooking time. The result, when done well, delivers the full intensity of the Maillard reaction on the outside, all those roasted and caramelized flavor compounds, alongside the cool, soft, almost sashimi-like texture of a barely warmed center. Cajun blackened steak uses a coating of charred spices, which is a different technique entirely, and Pittsburgh rare is definitely not a burnt steak. The charring is deliberate, controlled, and the entire point.